1889. A star is born. On November 20, 1889, a baby boy was born. He later grows up to become an astronomer, and plays an unbelievably critical role in our understanding of our expanding universe. His contribution to activated an ongoing series of events still rippling through time and space to this very day. In many ways he's the reason I concluded my investigation and the reason why you're holding this book in your hands now. His name is Edwin Powell Hubble, 1899. Like an enormous star 4 years before mankind officially took to the skies, an unknown object was observed in France which changed color from white to red and blue. It was described as appearing like an enormous star. 1903. The birth of mechanical flight begins. History was made when the Wright brothers became accredited with executing the first sustained manned flight. Man officially took to the skies. Mechanical flight becomes a reality. Only 2 years after the successful flight of the Wright brothers, a UFO described as a brightly glowing elongated, saucer-shaped object was then observed in Romania in 1905. Given that aircraft was a relatively new invention, this object did not conform to the design capabilities of the era. 1906. Zigzagging meteors. An object described as a Mr. A meteor was observed over Syracuse, New York, performing weird aerial maneuvers. During this year 3 saucer-shaped meteors were also observed falling in a zigzag fashion, before diving into the North Atlantic. 1909. Mystery airships. During 1909 strange nocturnal aerial objects were being observed across the UK. Described as oblong mystery airships, these objects were reported to have large lights, and were also capable of moving very fast. A huge illuminated object. During July and August that year, New Zealand experienced a wave of sightings. On July 24, a strange unknown airship which was described as a huge illuminated object was observed. Another sighting was made of an object which had bright lights. These were often observed moving at great speeds. Given that manned flight was still in its infancy, it's reasonable to conclude that these unknown aerial craft were not the product of secret military tests, let alone manufactured anywhere here on Earth during this early period of flight technology. 1912. On March 3, Wernher von Braun was born. He grows up to become a rocket scientist, and was later employed by Adolf Hitler to design the V-1 and V-2 rockets. At the end of World War II, he then becomes recruited by the American government, and continued to design advanced rockets which were then used in the space program. 1913. Phantom airships. Before long these strange sightings of unknown objects became tagged with the terms mystery and phantom airships, and were widely reported throughout the following years. During 1913 one sighting involved a large cigar-shaped object with a bright spotlight which was witnessed over Wisconsin. A fleet of these phantom airships were also reported in Toronto, Canada. These objects were never identified. 1914. Edwin Powell Hubble undertakes his Ph.D. in astronomy at Chicago University. This same year Lyman Spitzer Jr. was born. He later becomes known as the father of the space telescope, and spends his life making that vision a reality. 1915. National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. On March 15, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics (NARCO) was formed with the mandate to supervise and direct the scientific study of the problems of flight, with a view to their practical solution. It continued up until NASA later formed in 1958. 1921. John Herschel Glenn Jr. was born on July 18. He grows up to become the first American to orbit the Earth in the Friendship 7 capsule on February 20, 1962. 1923. On November 18, Alan Shepard was born. He later enters the astronaut program, and launched into space aboard Mercury 3 on May 5, 1961, becoming the first American in space. He later became the 5th person to walk on the Moon. Space-based telescope proposed pioneering German rocket scientist Hermann Oberth proposes the idea of a space-based telescope. 23 years later, American astrophysicist Lyman Spitzer Jr. then published a paper detailing the benefits of having a scientific astronomical manned space station. 1931. Flashing brightly, periodically vanishing, reappearing. A pearl-shaped white airship which flashed brightly was observed by Sir Francis Chichester during 1931. This object was also reported to periodically vanish and reappear, before accelerating and finally disappearing. He described it as a pearl with a tail. 1933. Luminous objects. During December 1933 many sightings of luminous objects were being reported all over Sweden. These objects came to be known as ghost flyers. Over 1,000 reports of these objects were generated across Sweden, Finland, and Norway over a 4-year period. These objects were never positively identified. 1934. On March 9, Yuri Gagarin was born. He later became the first man to be launched into space on April 12, 1961 aboard the Vostok 1. New York Times - July 11. Tesla Death Ray 250-mile range particle beam weapon announced. Distributes plans to Canadian, American, UK, Russian governments. The announcement of Tesla's Death Ray in 1934 demonstrates that the basic groundwork for particle beam laser-type weapons was already in place prior to the announcement of the Star Wars or Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI) program 50 years later. 1936. Hubble classifies the galaxies. Using new advanced telescopes, astronomer Edwin Hubble was able to set into place a classification system which is still used today. It is elegantly known as the Hubble sequence. 1938. Lyman Spitzer Jr. gains a doctorate in astrophysics. 8 years later he publishes a scientific paper entitled The Astronomical Advantages of an Extraterrestrial Observatory. The genesis of what would later evolve to become the Hubble Space Telescope was now formulating. Mass panic after the Martians' attack. On the 30th October of 1938 mass panic broke out across America after millions of people heard a radio program that reported the Earth was under an invasion from aliens. The broadcast was the radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. A fake news bulletin announced that around 3 million people had fled their homes and that roads were jam-packed with people fleeing New York City. It's no wonder then that in the years that followed, that UFOs were stigmatized with suspicious minds by both the military and public.